to Navigating the Four podcast, where we discuss all things faith, healing, leadership, and communication. Exploring the topic of communication, I'm Matt Barker, and I'm joined by the other hosts of the podcast. Tackling the topic of faith, we have Freed-Hardeman Professor of Bible, Matt Cook.
Hey, guys.
Exploring the perspective of leadership, we have Assistant Dean of Emerging and Innovative Programs at Freed-Hardeman, Mr. Jared Gott.
Hello.
And giving us the perspective of all things mental health, we have Director of the University Counseling Center here at Freed-Hardeman, Mr. Nathan Judd.
Hello, hello.
All right, thanks for joining us for this episode of Navigating the Four, where we bring you real talk, fresh perspectives, and a few laughs along the way. Whether you're in the middle of figuring out life or just here for some good conversation, you're in the right place. So grab a seat, maybe a cup of coffee, and let's start navigating the four together. All right, today's topic is sex, and we're going to turn it over to Matt Cook to talk about.
Why are you giggling already? Like
Not
the episode's
trying to.
just starting. So you said in your description that we do a little bit of real talk. So I guess today is the real talk day. I don't know why that I came up with this idea. I may regret it by the end of this. I think it's an important conversation to be talking about sex and the way the church talks about sex, or really the way the church in some cases hasn't talked about sex or talked about it in the wrong ways. So every fall in my Life of Christ class, we get to Matthew 5 and Jesus is talking about lust. And so I put this little poll out there online. Say, hey, do you think your church talked too much, too little, or just about the right amount about sex? And every time we do this, they always say, we talk about this way too little. There's an occasional person who will answer the question way too much, and I kind of push them and ask them what's going on, and they say, yeah, we talked way too much about how bad it is. All that to say, like, the kids that we're getting in, the students we have coming to Freed-Hardeman, their perception is they don't feel great about the way sex has been discussed. And maybe it's just we're just uncomfortable with it. I mean, Barker's just sitting here, can't stop giggling because he feels uncomfortable about this. So as you think about with sex, in church, how do you, why don't we talk about it? And then maybe connected to that, how have you seen it done poorly? Like, what's your experience with talking about sex?
I'm not uncomfortable with this at all. Let's
the
roll,
counselor
baby.
is the one who's most
I
comfortable.
think Nathan needs to start us off over here. Why have we not done it well?
What was I think there's a lot of shame around it for whatever reason. Conservative, traditional. Why is there a lot of I don't know why there's a lot of shame around it, but I think the word shame comes up for me, and it leads people to not talk about it, which when people have sexual struggles, shame is the thing that keeps them from working on the sexual struggles, to get involved in recovery, involved shining light on the things we struggle with. And
I mean, I do think it's one of those things that people, I'm going to say rightly so, I mean, tend to keep a certain boundary or level of privacy, right?
Yeah.
But I think then it's a very fine line of this is something that is good and healthy and private, and also like the fine line of wrong, right? Because we don't talk about it. So there's just kind of that very fine stigma line between this is something that's normal, natural, right?
Healthy.
Healthy, a celebrated thing from God, designed to do this, right? Versus, don't talk about that kind of a thing. It's just, I don't know. It's a weird topic even just how we're approaching it right now, right? Compared to all the other episodes we've done. It's how do you talk about it in a way that is considered healthy, but not too dismissive of, I don't want to say like the seriousness of it, but you know what I mean?
It's a sensitive topic.
It is, for sure.
You can't just every Sunday, let's talk about sex in church, right?
Yeah.
Right.
It's a serious and sensitive topic. I mean, again, I think maybe we've made it too serious, right? It's okay to laugh about this.
Right.
But I
Hope
think
so, because I have been.
Yeah, you haven't stopped, right?
I think when I was thinking about why churches neglect, I think if you're in say the pulpit, you have to be conscious of who all is in the audience. And so maybe thinking about not all audiences may be ready to hear it. If there's a younger audience, you might err on maybe we don't need to discuss this because there might be young ears. If you're just, for example, in a youth group setting, like Jared and I work with quite a bit, you have a wide range of ages where you don't necessarily want to talk about something in detail that they might not know a lot about yet, thinking about newer youth group members compared to seniors in high school. So you don't want to necessarily introduce the material that's like, oh, what is that? And then you don't want to open their mind to it too early either. And so I think we kind of err sometimes on the side of caution and just don't talk about it and neglect to talk about it because we don't want to introduce something that they might not be ready for, but we also don't want to make audiences uncomfortable and never want to come back to church either. I think that's we err on the side of caution, I guess is the short way of saying that.
That's a good word, caution. What are some ways, have you guys I don't know if we should go here, but like
We definitely should.
like, have you seen like really failed ways that people have taught about sex or talked about sex in churches that have made it where we didn't want to talk about it anymore or created a culture of shame? How have you seen us fail with this?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen people that talk about this topic a lot, and so you have this kind of like idea that, oh man, I'm a terrible parent because I haven't talked about this, and you almost feel judged, and it makes you like, I don't want to listen to you because you're kind of coming down on me here. And so I think there's that perception of like, not being real sensitive to the fact that like, yeah, we need to talk to our kids, but we need to do it in the way that's best for our family as well from a biblical perspective too. So I think sometimes there's a judgment factor there, I think.
You said something really important that I think plays into this whole conversation. You said about this kind of communication, I feel like you're coming down really hard on me, so I don't want to listen to you. Could that statement play into all of our conversations around the theme of sex, where when we are just coming down really hard on people, whether that's about talking to your kids about it, whether that's about whatever struggle that someone may have, we don't want to hear about it anymore. And so I want to come back to this later, but even when we talk about people who really struggle, every Sunday the preacher feels like they have to bash a certain segment of our culture or a certain belief system. How do you think that impacts the person who in the audience who is struggling? Do you think they're ever going to be comfortable bringing it up? And the answer is, of course not, because you've just bashed me into, I don't want to hear you talk about this anymore, and therefore I'm not going to talk about it. So I know that wasn't your point, but I think it's a really important communication thing to talk about.
I think the two scenarios that I'm thinking of where kind of have you seen it done poorly? In one scenario, it was more on the side of, okay, this person is communicating a lot about sex and sexual sin and all these things, but it is maybe a little bit too descriptive, graphic for the audience that is here, right? And so that was a little bit problematic of just sort of tone and audience recognition. I mean, the other one that I can think of was at a youth event, and the speaker was just hammering the idea of like, don't have sex, don't have sex, don't have sex, to the point that it was like, yeah, but you're not presenting anything positive on this topic. You're not, it's not even an encouragement of here's what to do. It's just the same phrase of don't. Like, okay, what are they supposed to take away from that other than let's not even talk about this at all. Let's not even bring this subject up, right? It's just uncomfortable.
Well, and when you have that message like don't do it, and we only talk about it sparingly, we're not allowed to talk about it. We have this felt sense of this is shameful. And so then when kids start hitting puberty and start desiring sex, and they think, well, there's something wrong with me. So I need to control this, and I'm not allowed to talk to anybody about it. And I mean, it's just a recipe for disaster.
I think the other thing involving churches isn't so much the messaging around sex. It's that when there are sexual issues or things that come to light, whether anything, right? Certainly a negative type of scenario is what I'm thinking. It's, again, not the messaging, but it's people's reactions. Right? It becomes sort of the nonverbal kind of that says a lot more about, okay, yeah, don't talk about this because things get weird.
I think, and you hear a lot of people talking about purity culture and evangelical Christianity, and I think some of our illustrations over time have been poor. You know, when the toothpaste comes out of the tube, can you get it back in? And the whole thought is, like, once you lose sexual purity, you cannot get it back. And I get the point. Like, we're trying to really help these teenagers. Unfortunately, the focus tends to be a lot on teenage girls. Like, we want them to see the value of sexual purity and the damage that can be done. Well, what does that communicate when later on they do commit sexual sin? And I mean, let's call it what it is. Like, it's okay to say that I'm guessing in the average church, 99% of people are sexual sinners or have been sexual sinners, right?
Sure.
So like, it's okay to acknowledge we all struggle with, but what's that do to that, girl in college who now maybe has a struggle or who has committed a sin, and she remembers when she was 14 that once you've lost your purity, it's gone and you can't get it back. Well, that then may lead her to think, well, what's the use in trying from here on out? So I think some of our illustrations, though sort of well-intended, have been either really creepy or really shame-inducing down the road when people struggle with sexual sin. And so I think that's one of the ways we failed. It's just some really poor attempts at trying to drive home the point. I don't know. So why should we be talking about it? And I guess, Nathan, I want to start with you because probably more than the rest of us, you deal with the negative impact of this. As a counselor of college students, you're seeing kids are coming to you before they come to me. Or if they come to me with a struggle, I'm going to be like, hey, you should go to the counseling center, right? Because I want to help you, but those guys are really prepared to help you. Based on what you've seen, why should we be talking about sex in our churches in more healthier ways?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about this, and I've given a lot of thought to it. I could approach that in a few different ways, but I would be surprised if there was a single male student on our campus who didn't struggle with pornography. And that sounds extreme, but I would be surprised if there wasn't a single one. So it is out there, and why that's the case, I mean, it's some of the things we're already talking about. A lot of females struggle with it too, and I think.
Could you put a percentage on that? Your guess, because it's higher than I think we sometimes assume.
Yeah, I have trouble saying because, well, for one, I'm a male, and I have had females talk to me about it, but my guess is the female population is underreported. So it's really hard for me to answer that, but I think it's pretty common. And my understanding is the types of pornography that girls use is often different than guys. For instance, books, like reading stories and novels is considered pornography for girls. So I don't know the answer to your question on that. I do think it's a lot more common than we realize. And again, I think we just need to normalize it and say, okay, like, I think when we think it's some huge thing and some big problem that we can't put the tube back or the toothpaste back in the tube, and so they just don't talk about it, and that's where people really struggle. So I think just letting people know you're not alone is a huge part in working on that. But I've also given thought to this. I want to share an idea, and I could go down the rabbit hole with this, but I did a study on Hebrews chapters 8 through 12 where it talks about the old law being a shadow of the new law, and basically how everything from the old law was brought over. We just have a fuller picture of it now. I started wondering, what if God gave us physical things that were shadows of spiritual things? And so I started looking at the world through that lens, like literally everything physical is a shadow of something spiritual, is my view. And so when you think about the story of the prodigal son, it's a story about our relationship with God, so we as parents can understand how far God's love and forgiveness and grace goes for us. But then I asked myself why God put sex around in the first place, because if I'm correct that everything is a shadow of something spiritual, then it's got to represent something. And the conclusion that I came to, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church, and we're the bride of Christ. I think that sex is designed to be a shadow of the intimacy that Jesus craves with us. That's what I think. And so instead of making it some taboo topic, but recognizing like Jesus wants all of us, we don't hold back. He just wants us to have that with him and not share that part of ourselves with anyone else. That's where I go with that. And I wish we talked more about what it represents and the bigger picture of it.
Yeah, you went kind of heavy and theological.
That's what I
interesting,
do.
Interesting theory. And I think I want to, like, I never really thought that far. At the very least, we would agree, regardless of what it represents. And you have to say that, like, any sort of relational intimacy, ultimately, what's the perfect version of that? It's relationship with Jesus. But at the very least, like, sex is a gift from God.
Yeah.
That is meant to have deep meaning. What else do you guys think about, like, why we should be talking about this?
I think you have to model a healthy outlook of it because, especially Jared and I work a lot with teenagers in the youth group. They're hearing things about this topic from school, from their friends or whoever, and it's probably not the best information they're getting. So as a church, we have to model what's the right way to look at this topic from a healthy perspective, because what they're getting now, culture is telling us this is the way that you should approach the topic of sex, and it's usually not accurate at all, right? So we have, as a church, we have to be able to give them that perspective of how does God want us to approach this topic. And if we don't, they're just going to get a lot of information that's not good information from their friends or from school or wherever it is that they're getting it. And as leaders, as parents, we have to equip ourselves to do that. With technology the way it is, they're going to, pornography, Nathan mentioned this, they're going to get this information somewhere more readily available now than ever. So we have to equip ourselves to be able to inform our kids, youth group members. Technology just brings a whole nother element to it because there's so many different ways now that they can communicate with each other. I was talking to someone yesterday about, how we have to talk to our kids now. You don't need to share pictures with other people. And, before when we were growing up, we didn't have cell phones, so we didn't really deal with that as much. So there's a generational thing there too. How our parents parented us is dealing with this topic is different than how we have to parent our kids now because of technology, social media. So really it's just about, we need to talk about it because we need to be able to give them the biblical perspective, but we also need to model that healthy outlook that culture's not giving us at all right now.
Yeah, and so much has changed that makes this more difficult to talk about. At the same time, some things never change.
What Matt was just talking about was the conversation is going to happen irregardless, right? And the conversation, though, I think is changing in a way. For example, I've been working with a youth group for a while now, right? And so when we started, there were still conversations about sexual sin, pornography, the sin of homosexuality, like all these things, right? We do a sort of informal Bible study with our youth group. And I've asked them before, kind of hey, here's a box. If you have topics you'd like to study, you have questions you want answered, come and put them in the box and we'll tackle those. And doing that over the last decade and a half, more and more of the questions are not what's wrong with transgenderism, homosexuality. Like that might have been where they started. Kind of what is this all about? The question now is more, why does it matter who loves someone else? Right? And that's what I mean is kind of the framing.
Yeah, it's a generational thing. They're more accepting of things that maybe we're not accepting of in this the new generation.
Well, they're going from the question of sort of what does the Bible say about this? What is this? All that to the question of why.
Why is this wrong? Yeah.
Right. Give me a rationale or an understanding about why any of this is sinful, or just sex in general. Like answer the why question for me. And so the conversation is changing, and it's changing in a way that I feel like does require really the church to be more involved. But at the same time, if the church is not involved in having those conversations are still going to happen. It's just that the church won't be involved in them. They're still going to have that conversation with friends, and more often than not, they're going to have that conversation with social media. And from there, who knows? It could be a bot, right, that they're getting information from. And so that's I guess kind of the concern. Even when we started talking about this topic, that's just been in the back of my head is like, what will my own kids, right? If I'm not going to educate them, what will educate them?
And maybe the difference that you're talking about, the shift is when we were in high school, maybe this conversation got brought up and we talked about what did the Bible say about this issue, but we didn't necessarily know anybody. I didn't have there were rumors, right?
Yeah.
In the late 90s, early 2000s about people. I'm a little older than you guys. But now, like, our teenagers have friends. Like, they know people who are in the middle of this, and so it's more real.
It's very personal.
Yeah, it's personal.
Right.
So all of that to say, like, we've got to be having good conversations, healthy conversations, obviously in the right context. There's certain things that don't need to be said on Sunday morning from the pulpit. Now, some things do need to be said, and we can talk about this in reasonable ways, but obviously in context, we're thinking about our audience and the smaller children in the crowd. So here's the real question. If we need to do this and need to be more effective with this, how do we communicate about sex in our churches more effectively? I'll throw a couple ideas out there, and we'll just kind of bat it around. Just jump in when you want to. I think, first of all, kind of from a theological perspective, we need to develop a biblical theological of sex that does not start with the negative, that does not start with the don't do it. As we said a few moments ago, sex is a beautiful gift from God. And I like to put in parentheses and fun when I put this on a screen for students with a winky face, and it really creeps them out. And I don't care, right? This is a beautiful and fun gift from God. And I think teenagers, even kids, need to know that sex, as intended by God, is good. It's not God, little g God. It's good. I think that's what we've done in our culture.
Yes.
We've turned it into it's God, little g. It's good, but it's not God.
We've turned sex into, and not even, I'm not talking about transgenderism or homosexuality or anything like that. I'm talking about just sex in general. We have turned sex into identity, right? Like, I mean, it's just, is that what you're all about?
Who you have it with and how often you have it has now become a major part of our identity in our culture.
Yes.
Which, if we're going to talk about how to talk about this in healthy ways, for Christians, our identity is not found in who I have sex with and how often I have it. It's found in Jesus. And so that's maybe an important piece of the puzzle, the theology of sex. What else?
I had a couple thoughts on this, and as I was looking through them, 2 or 3 of them kind of go together, but goes back to a little bit of what we were talking about before. We have to acknowledge the reality that we're in, the culture that we're in. It's going to be discussed, and we have to figure out from a communication perspective, how are we going to do this in the way that's most effective? Now, each parent is probably going to do this a little differently in how they approach it with their kids as far as how they approach that topic. But as a church, I think one way that we can do this well is, I guess the best way to word it is, we have to have a consistent message. It doesn't need to be where, like, you go to this class and they're talking about it one way, and then you go to another class and they have a different message they're giving you. As a church, it has to be something, and it might be a matter of training different leaders to be competent in the area of talking about sex, right? If you're going to have a class on it, then it needs to be where you're approaching this from a church, and this is the message that we want to share in a way that's healthy, in a way that is acknowledging that it is a good thing from God. And even though there's these things that culture tells us that are not good, these are some things that God tells us that is good, and we want to highlight those things and make that message be what's clear to those that we're speaking to. And it needs to be a consistent message. So I think in order to do it well, it has to be something that everybody is informed on, maybe even trained on. Maybe it takes someone like that's knowledgeable in that area coming in and talking and saying, this is some ways that we can do this from a biblical perspective. How can we maybe do better at that to where it's not such an uncomfortable thing? Again, acknowledging those cultural realities, I think you can tie it into some things. Hey, this is what we're dealing with in the world today. How can, as a church, we approach this topic in a way that's beneficial? And it's not something you're just like, hey, today we're going to talk about this topic, but it might be, hey, this is what's going on in the world right now. How are we supposed to view this as a church? And maybe that's a better way of kind of easing people into the topic.
Well, I'm thinking about, too, I referenced this in one of the other episodes, but I think if a preacher is uncomfortable talking about it from the pulpit, that gets passed on. So I think there's got to be working on your own stuff from the leaders and being open about it.
The reason we've not talked about it is because of shame, or like it makes us uncomfortable, and then it just creates this atmosphere where people when they are struggling, they don't feel like they don't know who to talk to, because they can't talk to their preacher because they think he's perfect, or the elders or their Bible class teachers or whatever. They just make this assumption that they've never struggled with this because nobody's ever been honest and authentic. Again, honesty and authenticity, there's a context. You need to do that carefully, and self-revelation. I don't know if that's the right, but like revealing things about your personal life has to be done with care. So yeah, I think one of the things, we do have to talk about boundaries, right? We do have to talk about, okay, Scripture is full of, from all the way from like sexual immorality is sinful down to like, watch the way you talk, like crude talk. You get to Colossians chapter 3 and 4. So like across the board, you got all of these boundaries that God puts into place. And I think one of the keys to like having good, healthy conversations is just asking the question, why would God put these boundaries into place? And it's because he created this, number one, like, and he knows what's best for us. And so he creates these boundaries because he loves us, not because he wants to restrict us in every way possible. And we talk about it sometimes, and I think our culture looks at us and says, those Christians, they just want to be so restrictive about this. Well, what if we said, number one, this is not us. We just believe God cares about us enough to put some boundaries in place. I don't know. That may be a good place to start.
Well, I would come back to my theory and say that this is more evidence of this is why when we leave the pattern that God gave us, we're getting further away from the shadow that he has for us. And
so, okay, let's come back to something you said a minute ago, Nathan, maybe kind of as our final talking point. You mentioned you've got people in our churches that struggle, right? How do we talk about this in a way, even some of God's boundaries, right? In a way that doesn't cause the person who is struggling to I don't know, kind of close the door on conversations about this in the future. So how can we talk about this in a way that is, yes, we have biblical convictions, but we also have compassion, and we want to be supportive of people who struggle with any sexual sin. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm thinking of one of the last conversations or studies we had on this topic, and it was answering some of those questions I mentioned that had been asked, like but what's wrong with, two people, irregardless of anything else, just, being in love with one another. And so we talked through, I think, Matt Cook, what you just said. We tried to establish at the very beginning of the study, here is what sex is, here is some of what sex is designed for, right? Both, like procreation, but also just relationship building. We talked about the idea of, if God had wanted, he could have made us food for sustenance without any of it tasting good or being enjoyable, right? If God had wanted, he could have made sex a biological function to fill the earth without any enjoyment in it at all, or any ability for it to create connection.
Isn't it cool that that's not what he did, right?
Right. And so that's kind of how we framed it, and then talked about, okay, and now here are the verses throughout the Bible that sort of frame, right? Here is guidelines for sex. And then talked about, now, the question we had been asked was, well, what does it matter about two people loving one another? Okay, it's fine. We can group everything in really kind of outside of it. If it's outside of this boundary, if it's outside of this guideline from God, then it's going against what he has told us to do. And then talked about that doesn't mean that anybody outside of that is just done for. Let's say that someone does have some type of attraction we don't understand, and that person then decides to live a life that is faithful to God and following
celibacy,
God.
Yeah,
sure, celibacy, or even just just in a constant rejection of sin, right? Man, what an incredibly strong person to be able to do that, right? Versus what we dismiss. Whether it's a heterosexual couple who, everyone kind of just assumes is, together, they're sleeping together or whatever, but it's considered more normalized, right? And just kind of, look, all of this, when you get outside the boundary, heterosexual, homosexual, whatever, if it's not within the boundary that God has established, then it is outside of that boundary. It is outside of what God has said. So we try, I don't know, it was just a conversation, I think, more about, let's stop nitpicking one thing over another and just, is this within what God has said to do or not, right? And just try to somewhat, I guess, normalize that conversation. I think it helped. I think just in general, talking about it more helps the conversation become more natural, right? Again, not every Sunday, not studying on it constantly and making things weird, but enough that, it's not once out of a blue moon where it's like, oh, what's happened? Where, now we're hearing a lesson on that. Just, it's all throughout Scripture. Of course, it should be referenced, pretty regularly. It's part of everybody's lives. I think that just makes it a little more normalized and able to be talked about.
And I think a lot of times it's the leaders that are more uncomfortable than the kids. Like the kids you talked about, they submit topics, right? And a lot of the topics they're submitting are things that they're dealing with in culture, and they want to hear more about it. It's sometimes the leaders that are sometimes hesitant about, like, do I really want to take on this topic or tackle it? You have to kind of shift that perspective. And that's kind of what Jared was talking about when this is the boundary, this is what's outside that boundary. How can we look at this a little differently? And so it's definitely a challenge, though, because sometimes we just don't feel super comfortable. We've been studying all quarter or this year in the youth group class about holiness. But in order to talk about what is holy, you have to talk about what's not holy. And so all these different things we've referenced as far as, this lifestyle is not a holy lifestyle. We're not set apart when we're living this way. You have to look at some of those negatives, right? What are these people in the Bible doing that God did not approve of? And how are we supposed to approach those relationships? So we have to acknowledge it, right? You can't just ignore it and hide it. The students and youth group members or whoever it is want to learn more about it. They want to know, how am I supposed to handle this if I'm in this situation, if I know someone that's a friend of mine that's in this situation? So, equipping them on the best way to do it, I think is really important. I mean, and how to do that is the challenge.
And I think from my position, from a biblical perspective, I will draw some lines and say, okay, from a biblical perspective, I have to say this is right or wrong. But most certainly, I think where we failed, maybe we've done a pretty good job of saying what's right and wrong. Probably to your point, where we failed is in showing compassion.
Oh my goodness.
In the way that we failed miserably.
Yeah.
And I think one of my favorite resources on this subjects of sexuality is Preston Sprinkle. Of course, Sprinkle's an unfortunate name in this case, but he's written some really great stuff that's very convictional. You may not land in the same place with him on everything, but man, he says some good stuff, really explores scripture, deals with both sides of the argument, but he also talks about compassion, and he tells stories. And one of the things that he says that I think, and maybe this is kind of where we'll wrap up today, is he notes, like, when a church says, when we take a position that says, okay, we believe X is wrong, then we are calling some people who struggle with certain temptations, we're calling them to a life of celibacy, right? And we may not like to even think of it that way, but that's what, like, if you're saying, okay, this is wrong, there's certain people we're saying, here's the lifestyle that we think you should live. Do we need to acknowledge how, you've mentioned this already, how absolutely challenging that is? And number two, if we're calling them that, who is their family? It better be the church. And 4 hours a week together doesn't cut it. Like, if we're really going to be Christian family to people who we are calling to, we believe Scripture is calling them to a sacrificial lifestyle, then we got to step up our game and really be family to people who are choosing to live sacrificially for Jesus. And that's, instead of isolating them and kind of pushing them to the margins, boy, we got to bring them in and treat them really authentically like family.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to end. Anybody else have anything else that they want to share? All right. Well, thanks for joining us today on Navigating the Four. We hope today's conversation sparked something real in your faith, your healing, your leadership, or your communication. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe, share it with a friend, and leave us a review. Till next time, keep showing up, keep growing, and keep navigating the four. We'll see you next time on Navigating the Four podcast.